Okay, thank you for coming in, for staying for the second panel. We want to build on some of the commentary and analysis we heard earlier this morning. And so I'll start off by asking each of our panelists who do work on very different subjects, both inside and outside of China, to give us a sense of how the reporting and research that they've been doing on their respective topics has changed over the last, say, 5 years. I think we can all agree that reporting and research in China and China's role in the world was very different before 2020, and that since 2020, roughly in line with both the greater tensions in geopolitics between the U.S. and China, as well as the pandemic, that things changed dramatically for both journalists and scholars. So I'd like to start with Jim Areddy on the end there from the Wall Street Journal, who I think very much experienced personally China's much harder line against journalists starting in the pandemic era, their own pandemic era, and then we can move onward to Margaret, Jeremy, and Shawn, and they can talk about the changes in their respective research techniques and difficulties since then.
Thanks, Ed, and happy to be here. I mean, this is almost softball question for me because how things have changed in the past several years. In early 2020, we started to hear about some kind of bug in Wuhan, and I had a chance to go down to Wuhan and see basically the government trying to keep something quiet. It was really unclear what it was they were trying to keep quiet, but we could look inside doors in hospitals and see where they would they would get their food deliveries and they're all wearing hazmat suits inside, and then they would close the door. So we knew there was something going on, and people were really afraid and nervous, and it was like amazing insight on the ground reporting that we could do. And again, he didn't even know what it was in January 2020. It was, what was going on. But by March 2020, I was told by the Chinese government that I was expelled. I had lived in Shanghai for 18 years. I had reported from there for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones for the entire time, and had previously been in Hong Kong. So a good, more than 20 years worth of my life was suddenly upended, and I had to. I could have gone pretty much anywhere, but I decided to go to New York City, and there I continued to report about China. I've had to, in many ways, reinvent myself because I can't do any of that on the ground, fire picking, looking around. And we have to rely a lot more on Xinhua News Agency and our own sort of understanding of how the country might work, how it is working, what it is that maybe they're not saying in the way that they report development. And I mean, just in a big picture, I think we're also looking at a situation where China just isn't releasing as much information. They're not as chatty. You can't easily speak with even government officials in the way that you could before. In a way, I think the U.S. government and politicians here in Washington are very often driving the debate about what's happening with China. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I mean, I think I'd echo a lot of the same comments, except that I've not been expelled. At least, haven't received that news. But early on, looking at this approximately 2 decades ago, slightly longer, right? There were a lot of efforts to travel to China to interface with those. And as was mentioned, I look at this through a largely China-Latin America lens. So I have the luxury of not only trying to understand what's happening in China and Chinese views on Latin America, Chinese policy toward Latin America, but also traveling throughout the region to understand how China's engagement is manifesting and has evolved over time. I'm still able to do that, right? And so have, a lot of access in that respect. But what is missing largely is that ability to engage as extensively as I had in the past with the network of scholars, of others, those that were shaping policy in different directions and in different forms, that really provide critical insight on China's views on Latin America, on the direction of certain policy, the effectiveness of certain strategies, perceptions on the China-Venezuela relationship, for instance, which have soured considerably in recent years, and understanding that directly from the observations of those that I had established relationships with there in China was invaluable. So it's changed really dramatically in that way. I think another thing I would mention is that the relationship itself has evolved considerably over, unsurprisingly, right, over the course of 2-3 decades now, really since this period of enhanced engagement that started in the 1990s in Latin American context. And, as it matures, it becomes more complex. I mean, what used to be a focus on mostly by high-level bilateral engagement is now a focus on, extensive subnational engagement. What used to be a focus on massive infrastructure project development, right, sort of emblematic of the Belt and Road Initiative around 2015, 2016, is now largely a focus on much smaller projects, right, with shorter overall timelines, smaller budgets, that are prolific at this juncture, right, but are very hard to track, and are often, again, taking place at the local level. And then at the same time, we have seen, I would say, over the past 6, 7, 8 years, a massive increase in the amount of people-to-people engagement between China and wide-ranging different Latin American actors, right, that also has really critical implications. And so the complexity inherent in this new phase in the relationship makes it that much more difficult to track, right, even if you do have access to Latin America, and even if you do have, the ability to travel across the region and do the kind of research that you might want to do. And so, what that means, and I'm sure we'll get into this, so I won't say much more about it, but, that means that it will be critical for those of us here that are tracking these things, for those of us in China that are tracking everyone, right, to build networks that include those that are on the ground and monitoring these things in a real-time way, right, that are really fully plugged in and understand these developments and their wide-ranging implications, whether from an environmental, social, economic, right, perspective. And there are some major impediments and challenges and obstacles that we need to be overcome, and having to address them in the session.
So thanks, and I'm very excited to reiterate a lot of the comments that were made in the first panel. These two speakers, I can say for myself in 2020, so 5 years ago, I was finishing a book about statistics in China and the role of numbers and the manipulation of numbers as a key piece of governance inside of China. And that project, one of the nice things about being academic is the extent to which you get to choose your own projects and kind of where you want to go next. And so in part, because of the intangible nature of that project, I was very interested in working on something very material and tangible, but it also, because of COVID and the closing, the kind of increased difficulty of doing fieldwork in China, thinking about something that I could study using the GIS or satellite techniques that were talked about at the end of the last panel, kind of that are in material statistics or trade statistics that are verifiable from outdoor or from external sources. So I've moved towards thinking more about climate change and China's intersection with the problem of global climate change, decarbonization. And part of that is because of interest and its importance. And wouldn't change it for anything in the world, but it did have this strategic piece that it is easier to study because it talk to people on the ground and they're not necessarily aware where their power is coming from. Like what is the generation mix in Shanghai at 12 o'clock in the afternoon? It's not an interview-based topic as much as others are. And so I think the strategic choice of a topic that can be analyzed in a world where it's harder to fly to China, it's harder to be in China, interviews in China are less forthcoming than they used to be. And then even the data itself, there's just less data released than there was previously. So I think from an academic's perspective, trying to be strategic in the questions that we try to ask and that we can answer well is something that I've thought about over the past 5 years. Well, thanks everyone for having me. I apologize if I'm looking at my phone. I've got a story that's on the runway that may go out at some point during this panel. So, look, I echo everything that's been said, beforehand. I'm in a slightly different position that I was never based in China. I was based in Asia. I was based in Hong Kong for the Financial Times at the time, was editing China, coverage from there. But I've been looking at kind of how China is interacting with the rest of the world in one way or another for most of the last 10, 15 years. And the big change for me, besides not being able to go to China a couple times a year, which was invaluable because China really does look different up close than it does in the kind of sometimes the cartoon pictures that are of it, or the stereotypes. But it's also just being able to engage and have frank conversations with Chinese economists, with Chinese officials outside of China. Everyone's just gotten a lot more shy, right? And everyone's just gotten much more cautious in sharing frank views and in being quoted, right? And we as journalists like to be, we're just vehicles for other people's opinions and analysis in a lot of ways. And it's harder to get that kind of frank analysis. I keep wondering if we're, I think of the China that I interacted with when I was based in Indonesia in the early 2000s. And that was the kind of China going shyly out into the world. It was the time when, there was a colleague James King wrote a very good book in 2006 about China Shakes the World. And at the time, it opens with this amazing scene of manhole covers disappearing around the world. And it was a story of China's appetites to shake the global economy as a result. And in Indonesia, I saw covered the Indian Ocean tsunami in late 2004 and 2005, and I remember watching this kind of aid mission of Chinese. I think they were PLA or they were kind of emergency response, setting up camp at the airport in Banda Aceh, right next to this field hospital that had been set up by USAID. And there was one country that was very good and had a lot of practice at kind of responding to emergencies in the US, and you could see them kind of racing to get involved. And then you can see China, this Chinese group of a few dozen people kind of setting up this very neat camp at the airport and then just waiting to see where they were needed, right? And then on day one, it was like they didn't leave the perimeter around their tents. And then on day two, they kind of moved a little bit closer. By day three, they were working with the US in the field hospital in some ways and kind of helping just because everyone was needed on the ground. And now I feel like we have this completely different China. It's just much more confident in going out into the world, and yet is very cautious. You might even say sometimes thin-skinned in its engagement with the rest of the world, and protects its image incredibly carefully, and that really hits us on a day-to-day basis when we're trying to engage, just have frank conversations, just to understand what's going on.
I wanted to just go more deep into some of the research topics that each of you work on. And when we start off with Jeremy, I had a thought in my head when you were talking about how scholars have the freedom to a certain extent choosing their research topics, and how you veered from studying statistics to studying changing environmental policy, because it reminded me of something that a professor told me at grad school, where he was saying Benedict Anderson did Imagine Communities, sort of seminal book, because he was banned from doing research in Indonesia. So he could no longer do Indonesia-specific research, and decided to write this book up with vast transnational theories instead. So like that can really change the scholarship. But you are still able to go to China. You went to China this past summer. And so I want to ask you two questions related to your research. One is, what did it feel like to be on the ground so recently in China? And how is that shaping the research you're doing, having that access? And two, in terms of how we think about China's environmental policy, I was just thinking that it's often discussed in this duality where China is either, the savior of humanity because it is innovating green technology and pushing out in the world, or it will lead to the planet's destruction because it's still the greatest greenhouse gas emitter, and is still invested in coal. So I was just wondering, there's this duality in the discourse. I was just wondering how, as a researcher, you made sense of that through your on the field, on the ground research.
That's great. So I was in based in Shanghai this summer for about a month. I did take a side trip to Ordos in Inner Mongolia, which for me was this great location that is a microcosm of China's kind of political economy. It is if you know about Ordos, it's probably because of the Go City reporting about it now 18 years ago, where there was empty buildings and row after row of apartment buildings and empty plazas. But it also is it's a coal town. The Go City was built on coal mining profits. And so, but it now it's the Western China where there's lots of space, there's lots of wind, and there's lots of sun, and you have huge renewable energy mega basins. So being able to go and actually see that the Go City is not full but not empty is like kind of something that you can read in statistics, but you can actually feel it in person that the buildings are not unoccupied in the way that they were. But to know that there's 30,000 people that are under the ground at any one time in Ordos kind of mining coal, but there's also gigawatts of solar happening at the same time. There's just nothing that can really, even if you know those statistics, you can read the corporate reports that suggest this is happening, actually go and see the realities of them and to talk to the people who are doing that work is really invaluable. On the broader narrative, it is this kind of from villain to hero or potential hero narrative that I think is really fascinating and has a lot of truth in it. So for instance, last week, Xi Jinping announced China's updated commitment to the Paris Agreement, its NDC. And a lot of the coverage of that of the new commitments, the update was quite positive. It was tepid but positive. And in part that's because of the United States. The United States, because Trump has again pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and kind of is talking about beautiful clean coal. China's relatively unambitious targets, emissions reduction targets by 2035 of 7 to 10% reductions it was seen as the adults in the room. This is serious, someone taking decarbonization seriously in a world that isn't. But I think something that I think is really important for China scholars and journalists to think about is not just to think about China as a funhouse mirror of the United States or as competitor to the United States, but take China on its own terms. I think one of the hardest things that I found, not in research terms, but in writing terms, what editors want is to write about China as China. And that kind of with its nuance and complexity and to dive into different places and different stories that don't all fit together in a neat way or that is dangerous or something else. And so I think that's when I think about where kind of like my frustrations with the NDC and the weakness of the fact that it's been accepted as this positive development, when I think it really reflects a real political economy weakness of the state, is to me one of the things that I think is my sense of trying to right size and kind of right shape China.
Margaret, right now the discourse in DC around China and Latin America is oftentimes about US-China competition. And it's not just Latin America, it's also, how we frame Africa, usually like US policy and China policy on Africa as well as Southeast Asia. So I'm just wondering how you, in your research, how you try and go deeper. And when you talk with, policymakers here in Washington, how do you try and impress on them a more nuanced look at Latin America, not just viewing through the lens of China? And I do feel that there's an underscoring now in this administration of that rivalry because of their focus on the Western Hemisphere and what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question, and I would go so far as to say that it's not just a focus on looking at this through the lens of US-China competition, but also really focusing on specifically and almost exclusively on those developments in Latin America, China-Latin American context that have potential national security implications for the United States in the event of a potential conflict, right, between the US and China. So when you look at the reporting, I mean, this includes on, journalistic and academic, if we're looking at case studies in particular, so much of the focus is on those projects that are deemed to review to have a potential dual use capacity, right, civilian military capacity. So we've heard a lot about Shanghai, the Shanghai port, right, which is a massive port. China has partly or majority ownership and control in many forms of that port in Peru. And it is deemed to be, or considered to be, broadly speaking, among the policy community here in the US, something that could be leveraged to China's benefit in the event of a future conflict. The other areas of focus tend to be other sort of, primarily maritime transport infrastructure, such as the Panama Canal, but other canal related and infrastructure projects that are also of concern for the same reasons. Surveillance capabilities, right, whether they be space related or at the local level, but that would again introduce vulnerabilities for the US military or others in the event of a conflict. And so this is, my concern is that not just that this is being viewed right through a primarily US-China lens, but that it's only part of the story, right? If you're talking about US-China competition, it goes further than that. Where so much of what's happening, right, is in the digital space. It's in massive investment across what China has called new infrastructure, right? These innovation-related industries, and we're seeing extensive growth in those areas. I wouldn't call it dominance, right, across the board, but certainly a very competitive position for Chinese companies across countries and across sectors. And so, that story in many cases is not one that we're hearing about in much depth. And so, I think what I try to impress upon those who are thinking about this in a strategic, from a strategic dimension here in Washington, is that the story is bigger, and not just that it's bigger, but it's ever evolving, right? It's continuously evolving. There are all kinds of actors and factors that are shaping this, right? Both in China, if we think about Chinese policy and the challenges that China is facing and the implications of the policy making that China is introducing. The US has a role to play in this too, as we know, and we've seen some efforts, and we'll likely see more efforts, right, to engage in this space in an effort to shape outcomes. But also important to this is the Latin America story, and that's one that tends to be left out, I think, almost entirely, right? This is a co-produced relationship, right? China, of course, has interests, right? It has some policies that are governing the ways in which Chinese companies are engaging in different sectors across the region and the mechanisms through which they do that. But so many of the outcomes are driven by Latin American actors, and in ways that many may not anticipate, right? Things can go completely sideways for a lot of different reasons, to be they political in nature because of the reactions of NGOs and the effectiveness of their efforts in derailing certain projects, because projects fall out of favor, things go terribly wrong in the construction process. Really, you name it. And so that story too is one that's really missing, and one that needs to be understood, and that I try to press on my students, but also, when making or having these conversations with policy level.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Margaret. So can you give us an example, one or two examples of like a thing that we're missing in Latin America, or that's missing from the discourse right now on the China-Latin America relationship? And do you have a specific country or specific type of interaction country to tell us about? That'd be great.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there are a few things that we need to, perhaps there's some assumptions, right, that are being made. And I don't know, that the story is always missing, but sometimes the assumptions are taken for granted, right? Or they are, at least in the policy making space, one comes across, some of the same narratives over and over, even though, as I mentioned, this is an evolving dynamic, right? And things may be changing in the moment, more or less. One is, what China wants out of this relationship, and that certainly is something that has changed over time. There's a degree of continuity, there's a kind of resource-seeking activity, market-seeking activity, an effort to make Chinese companies, competitive across domains and across sectors. But beyond that, now we see a wide-ranging new policies being implemented in China that have implications for Latin America and the way in which companies will engage or not engage, as the case may be. And in the past year or two, Latin America has been somewhat deprioritized, at least from an investment perspective and in comparison to other regions. Another, I think, really important question that we need to ask is the extent to which the US itself and its interest in competing with the US is driving what China is doing in the region, right? There's an assumption, I think, here in Washington, that this is a big part of the equation. It may be in certain instances, in certain countries, and in certain, certain types of engagement, but it's perhaps not the driving factor, right, for so much of what is happening across the global South and indeed in the Latin American context. Another, I think, critical story that we need to cover is this question of an understanding more depth and are these questions of lessons learned, right? How is China evolving based on what it's learned about what it should do and not do, right, in pursuit of certain objectives, be they commercial or political in nature or otherwise, and about shifting perceptions in Latin America of what it is to work with China, how best to achieve certain objectives. Certainly, the Ecuador of Rafael Correa is not the Ecuador of today, and the way in which Ecuador is engaging with China is very different based on the experiences had about 10 years ago. And the same can be said, I think, in other countries where they're beginning to see the effects of recent policy decisions in China, economic policy decisions, and in some cases are describing what they're feeling as an inundación, right, as a flooding or of activity. So some don't go so far as to call it dumping, but a lot of this excess capacity, right, the effects of Chinese policy are being felt in the global South and in specific countries in particular in ways that are very worrisome and may very well change the nature, dynamic, tenor of these relationships in the years to come. So, I mean, it's not as though we're not getting it right necessarily, or but it's a lot of these stories just aren't being explored or told, I think, in enough depth to demonstrate the extent, the dimension, right, and the depth of this relationship and how it is indeed one that is ever evolving.
And Jim, you talked about how your exposure from China then led you to have to report on China from the outside. And you said very specifically that a lot of the conversation, at least in the US, is now dominated by what policymakers say here in Washington. And so I think for both of our newspapers, a lot of the stories that we end up doing are framed through that discourse. How do you grapple with that, having been someone who's recently reporting China? And then when you choose stories or when you approach stories here based in the US, how do you try and navigate around or into the conversation of US-China policy?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. As the story is so much a G2 issue, whether it's in Latin America. I mean, I think that what Margaret's saying is exactly right, that we're not really listening to, why Peru might want to have the Shanghai port in the same way that we're thinking about it in the dimension of US-China relations. And the US government, it clearly, it's always the question is what is the administration's China strategy? And it's never really very clear, right? I mean, it's almost a full-time job is trying to figure out what the administration's China policy is. And that's everyone, that's each administration. And we have voices in China, the creation of the Select Committee on China, for instance, is supposed to be a clearinghouse for ideas on China. And I'm not sure that every voice in Washington is super informed about China. I think that many politicians are proudly proud to say I've never been to China and I never will go to China. And in one of the arguments that they would make is, I could be an expert on Iran and North Korea and never go to those countries. I think that's missing a lot of the story. In terms of trying to understand, trying to interpret what a policy might be from Washington and try to understand who the players are and why they'd be saying certain things, that's an ongoing job. One of my British newspaper friends would always say that their question is always, why is this liar lying to me? And that's sort of the starting point for reporting, which I think is a sort of good rule to, sort of keep in the back of your mind. As I'm not in China and dealing much more with Washington, there's so many fascinating ideas that are coming out of this city in terms of expertise. And some of those are from politicians, a lot of them are from think tanks, but I don't know, you almost have to pick your battles. What is it that I'm going to focus on? And then you just try to talk to lots of people and try to build a certain story. But I'm going to agree with Margaret again. I think it very often just becomes this, what is the rivalry between US and China and how this issue or that issue is seen through that rivalry. But the business is incredibly complex. I mean, how many people were reporting about NVIDIA 5 years ago? Or could even spell it or knew what it was. And it's so technical, whether you're dealing with China from the automotive sector or the human rights or technology like NVIDIA. It's so technical that I think you have to look more and more, not for the noise, not for the flashy lights or the great quote, that you really have to dig a little bit harder to try to understand what's the complexity here.
I want to follow up and ask you a structural question about the newsroom, because I know that, when reporters from the Journal were expelled from China, then you created these satellite newsrooms around the world, and also because people were rotating out of China. So I know in Washington you had a team of China specialists and that team has ended now. And then you're in New York, and there's also a team of China specialists in New York. So do you all divide up your beats so that, for example, someone from your team is supposed to focus on China's interaction with the US and you have more latitude, for example, to choose different topics on reporting on China out in the world? Or how does it work beat by beat, and especially following the elimination of the Washington team? And now it's just the New York team, I think.
The sausage making is never very pretty.
But as a journalist, I know the structure is very important for what stories end up getting reported. So that's why I asked you that question.
It's really story by story, and we're figuring it out all the time. We've had many management changes at the Wall Street Journal and structural changes. I think that increasingly they're trying to put more of the power for the story in Singapore, which is becoming our base. We have fewer people in Hong Kong. We still have people in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore. And we have a few people. We have 3 foreigners in China itself, mainland China, in Beijing. We do work collaboratively. So there's a certain amount of freelancing, but it's in many ways, it's both top down and bottom up in terms of the way we report. We don't have one particular system in terms of how we break it up, but we try to be involved in stories that are going to be touching on China, and that's increasingly everything. And I think that and that doesn't always work out. Sometimes it's news to the bureau chief in Beijing that somebody's writing something about China. We do have a team in New York, Ling Wei and me, and we work together, but we sort of work separately. I mean, it's not a great answer because each topic is different, but we are trying to centralize it more from Singapore.
Great, thanks. And Shawn, has your story published yet?
Just went out.
Okay, I'm wondering if our editors will call, Jim's editor Miter will call us to on the story, but
I hope so.
right. So your entire beat is right now firmly immersed in U.S.-China relations because we're reporting on tariffs, we're reporting on the trade relationship, which is for President Trump the central aspect of the U.S.-China relationship. So how do you approach that beat? And it's very different than in the Biden administration. How has the change in administrations changed the way you approach reporting on U.S.-China?
Yeah, and it's very different from the first Trump administration as well, which I think is an important point as well. Look, I don't know that there is a China strategy right now. I think that's and trying to figure out what it is and who is driving it is one of the key questions. The story we just published is that the Chinese going into the Madrid talks offered a big surge of Chinese investment into the US economy in return for a lifting of curbs or loosening of curbs on inbound Chinese investment. We don't know yet if President Trump would accept that, but we're talking probably about trillions of dollars in terms of the size of the offer. And we know that President Trump, and this is a change from his first term, has really made inbound investment and attracting inbound investment a pillar. He's talked about $17 trillion in investment coming into the United States, which is, if you know the size of the US economy, it's about $29-30 trillion economy. Seems improbable, at least in a short period. But you know, we are in this world right now where, as we were discussing this story, where it's like, well, this is a complete red line. For the last 10 years, the policy in the United States has been to restrain Chinese investment, to harden up the CFIUS constraints. As recently as February, the Trump administration was putting out an America First investment policy document in which they were talking about China as a strategic rival and really taking a hard line towards any Chinese investment in the United States and applying greater scrutiny of it. Well, the guy who wrote that memo has since left the administration, was turfed out. And we are in this world now where all of a sudden the administration is okay with selling NVIDIA chips to Beijing, where we seem to have a changing cast of the advisors around President Trump, and we have a transactional president, and a moment when that might be possible. So I think this is, to me, the central challenge is like figuring out what might he actually go for, right? And what might might President Trump actually sign off on? And then how might that shape the broader US-China policy? Might we see a return to a much more commercially driven economic relationship rather than one where national security is the overwhelming force in the room? Might there be some kind of rupture between the White House and Congress over this? Might the Select Committee lose influence over China policy? Might someone like Jensen Huang be in fact the most important advisor to the president when it comes to China policy? And then we're also seeing, I think, and this gets into what Margaret was talking about, the kind of narrative about, the easy narrative about a G2 and this competition and so on. We're seeing a changing relationship in Europe. Just what is happening with electric vehicles in Europe is fascinating, right? They have put up tariffs on the one hand against Chinese vehicles, and at the same time, they're welcoming, cautiously, but welcoming the building of Chinese EV factories in Europe. BYD is now looking at its third site in Europe, which is remarkable. And I remember sitting down with the Spanish economy minister last year at one point, and him pointing out that they had a former Peugeot plant I believe it was a Peugeot plant in Spain that had been bought by a Chinese EV company. And he said, what do I do? I get the whole point of putting up a barrier to EVs. I get that they might be, really tough competition for a European auto industry, but they're creating jobs in a place that needs jobs. right now. And I think that is the kind of where the narrative is going to turn. And, you know, we'll see what happens. We've seen Chinese investment in the US before. There's that famous documentary, American Factory, about Fuyao Glass. And some of us have probably I've been to that plant outside of Dayton, and it's still there. And we'll see what happens with places like that. But it's not a static relationship, right? The narrative isn't here, and it's not stuck. It's going to change, and it's going to evolve, and it might surprise us.
Thanks, Shawn. I wanted to start asking audience questions, but I just want to note something about the narratives and how we need to move past certain narratives. I was here at a Hawkins event just a couple nights ago where a filmmaker I knew from who had been based in Beijing and another filmmaker were presenting a film called Made in Ethiopia about China. And it was about looking at a factory similar to the one in the Midwest that you just mentioned about the Chinese factory in Ethiopia. And one of the people on the panel after the film was saying that in Washington, we always talk about US-China competition in Africa, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation with Margaret on Latin America. But he was noting, this is a former US diplomat, he was noting that America just isn't present economically in Ethiopia. It's really dumb that we talk about this competition in Africa when the US isn't even there competing on a commercial level in Ethiopia. So it's like a fabricated conversation that we're having here in America. And I think a lot of the issues you talked about, Shawn, about fact that China is putting investment in other countries with BYD and other vehicles is the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely vital. I think we've gone from a world in which, and this is, you know, taking the longer arc of history, post-World War II world, in which the US was the power that was going out there and creating jobs and opportunity in a lot of other parts of the world, whether it's in the Marshall Plan or moving to Latin America. I think of something like Citibank, right? There are city bankers all over the world of different nationalities. They had subsidiaries all over. I think of GE. I think of all these big American companies that were going out into the world and setting up operations and so on. And that just doesn't happen very much anymore. The US, and this started in the first Trump administration, the second Biden administration, we saw it also with IRA, where it was sucking in investment. Right? And it's still, I think, a net exporter of FDI, but it's not the same presence that it once was. And in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, China has all of a sudden become this big source of outbound investment into places like Ethiopia, and so on. And a lot of it was through Belt and Road, right? And there was huge suspicion here in Washington about that. There were lots of questions about how it was done and who actually got the jobs and the exporting of Chinese labor into a lot of these places. But for a lot of other countries in the world, China has been a job creator. And the US has kind of been this lecturer for a while, and now is kind of pulling back and saying, actually, we want you to invest in us instead.
I think some of the conversation around Belt and Road in the first term administration shows how some journalists and others, including in my paper, got the narrative wrong because they focused a lot on what Washington was emphasizing, which is this debt trap diplomacy. And it turns out a lot of the projects aren't actually a form of debt trap diplomacy. I think that was a big, misfire on the way that both U.S. policymakers and journalists and maybe some scholars were interpreting the outcome of Belt and Road projects. So I think we've seen the discourse on that. Because the reality is not what people were saying the first time.
Yeah, although to be clear, a lot of the structure of a lot of the financing that China put out as part of the Belt and Road was pretty tough. I mean, using accounts that kind of capture export revenues in order to pay to pay off loans. I mean, Aid Data has just done some fantastic work detailing just the structure of the financing. And so on, but you can't, and you can look at countries like Zambia and Ghana and so on, and there clearly is a debt issue there, and China plays a big part in that. But yeah, it's not as simple as purely about that.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm thinking of is that a lot of the framework, especially it was being pushed by some officials in the first Trump administration, was that there's a centralized effort to get countries into debt so that then they would be able to turn commercial ports into military ports for the PLA, things like that. So anyways, let's go to questions now in the audience. The woman in the green there.
My name is Tara McKelvey. I used to be with BBC and with Radio Free Asia. And I'm wondering if you can tell me about how you see the Ministry of State Security or the Chinese intelligence services. Obviously, they can't be here, but they have assets, sort of. And I'm wondering what your impressions are both of the services themselves and how it affects your life, if it does.
Internal security is Jim.
I mean, this is a really rich source of stories in the United States. I mean, it's something that I've spent a lot of time on. I was just talking with somebody last night, and we were talking about United Front. If you start to think about how United Front operations work around the world, it can very quickly sound like you're talking like conspiracy theory. You know, that they're everywhere, but they're nowhere. You know, do they exist? Do they not exist? And I think that it is a dimension of China that really demands a lot of coverage. And we look at that transnational repression. I was just walking around in New York City the other day, and there was a giant piece of art, not exactly my taste, but it was quite interesting, which was the subject of a major operation by United Front people in China to go after this China-born artist. I think he was based in California. He made this giant head of Xi Jinping with all of these corona spikes in it. And these people who were affiliated with Beijing went and destroyed it in the California desert. And I think that people went to prison over it because they were unregistered agents of the Chinese government. So it's a real thing, and we cover it quite a bit.
In the front here with the glasses.
Hi, this is Wendy, a postdoc from University of Virginia. So I have two questions. One for the journalists here, like Jeremy and Shawn. So do you see your role as a journalist from a professional outlet shifting over the years? I'm asking because, as you know, a lot of audiences, they consume China stories from ordinary social media users. There were a lot of like TikTok explainers out there explaining what's going on about Chinese internet culture, what's the daily life here in China, and something like that. Do you sense a bit of like competition, or how do you see your advantage still as a professional outlets like journalists? And then second question, I will be quick. For Margaret and Jeremy at the same time, because I teach Chinese media class at the institution, so I know like teaching China class is quite challenging these days because it causes a lot of tension and also disputes. There's one group of students probably have strong opinion about China, and there's another group of students not knowing China much yet. So I don't know, like probably a lot of us can relate to my situation here. So how do you see the do's and don'ts when you teach Chinese classes in the classrooms? What's your advice and best practices?
You want to start with the journalism?
Yeah, I have a 20-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, and if I was to pop on TikTok, I would probably get excoriated at home. And so I think there's and you know, and there is some there's always, I think, some pressure in the newsroom to do social media stuff in videos and so on. I consume less social media than I did a few years ago. It's healthy. I also really appreciate sometimes the surprising depth of the conversation on social media about stuff. I know I was kind of tossing away TikTok videos and so on, but there's a level of communication that's happening there that isn't just cute cats. And so I think my job and is to kind of start a conversation and to kind of introduce new facts. I mean, my kind of AI strategy is, and the way to kind of keep my job and in an AI world is to do things that AI can't. And so AI is very good at aggregating existing information. But if I can throw new information into the mix, at least for a few seconds of the day, I'm gonna have relevance to the conversation, right? And then the conversation kind of goes from there. So but I really admire colleagues who are very good at tapping into the memes and doing social media. I've got a great face for radio and probably a constitution for print.
See something about those videos. I think that it's partly just the way social media is developing, but another part of it is I think the Chinese government runs a very, very sophisticated media program. And it is tapping into influencers who basically just say positive things about China. And some of the things that they point out are really, really fascinating. The subway that goes through the buildings in Chongqing and things like that. And I think it is with fewer Western reporters in China, they're getting fewer of those kind of stories because we are just focused too much on, we're not focused too much, we focus a lot on the great power relationship. When if we had more people, if we had back to the whatever 15 or so people that we had Westerners in Beijing and Shanghai, we would be doing these kind of stories, but I think we'd be doing it in a more balanced way than this is just rah about China and asking questions about that. I think it's a new dimension, but I think we really have to see the hand of the Chinese government, the Chinese state in the media there.
On the education question of teaching, I'm teaching a class this semester, Chinese politics and climate change. And that class is great because it has students that really care and are very knowledgeable about climate change and know nothing about China. And there are students that know a lot about China and don't know a lot about climate change. And so it's tough in the sense that I have to try to bring up to speed the class in different ways and then kind of like integrate these discussions. So it's not just about climate change broadly, but about Chinese kind of decarbonization and the politics and political economy there. So my advice, such as it is to try to think about China classes. If it's just China, that's hard. If you have like a set of students who are Chinese and a set of students who are not, or who have a deep background and those who don't. On the other hand, I will say that when I have taught these kind of big intro to China classes, I've had Chinese students come up to me and say things that they are learning about China that they didn't know themselves. And I guess I can thank the propaganda apparatus for allowing my work and my kind of lectures to have some utility even for those who grew up in the country.
I won't add too much more to that. I have, similar challenges. And then also, of course, teaching about China, Latin America, you have those that are Latin Americanists, right? You have those that come with a China background, some that have a little bit of both, right? And then some that are more focused on different functional domains, right? And are interested in understanding how those apply in this particular relationship. So it's really a mixed group, which is it's a blessing in many ways, right? You have all of these strengths, and so it really contributes to the discussion. Everyone can bring something to bear, and so the idea is to get, at least at the beginning of every semester, I try to do a little bit of a who's who mapping, right? Just to get a sense of who are we talking about on all of these sides, and what is it really? Who are the institutions? It's a little bit 101 for some folks, right? But all tolerate it because they get a little bit out of that exercise. And then inevitably over the course of the semester, there are conversations about Chinese statistics, the reliability of statistics, what it means to, do real data work, what you have to do, getting into the trenches on that, right? And we even do some exploration of some of the work that I've done in other institutions, trying to pull together this data and have it for the first time. And then also, how do you read? This comes up every semester too. How do you read how should I interpret these policy documents? What are, what is the terminology that's being used? Is there value in looking at these things over time? What different methods can be used to really glean as much, right, from all of these different documents as possible and incorporating those in the syllabus, as well as other, foreign language materials that can be utilized by the different students in the class with different strengths.
And the second relative. Right behind you, yeah. Right third row.
Thank you for this. My name is Nayan. I'm a journalist as well as a policy research analyst. So I'm a contractor with the Rhodium Group right now. I have a couple of questions. One about, I think, Edward, you mentioned about the narrative piece of it. I'm just thinking in terms of the coverage that comes out of the West these days, or even the last few years, maybe a decade, from China. Is more about, even when you look at clean energy sector, where China has clear leadership, but the coverage is sometimes focused more on the problems with that, the problems of overcapacity, or the problems of China choking other countries of those technologies. So my question is, how much influence, of course there is an influence of national security concerns of the US on Chinese policies, how much of that is reflected in the reporting right now, and what can be done to make it more objective in our writings? Second question, just about, very quick question about the popular myths about China. You already mentioned about the debt trap diplomacy. I just maybe want to know from the speaker about more, like, do you have a list? I do have my list, but I don't want to share, so I don't want to follow your opinion. But do you have a list of popular myths that have currency even now when we talk about China? Thank you.
I have my own thoughts on this, your question about national security concerns, but I want to hear from Shawn and Jim about, since they obviously grapple with this question coverage.
I was gonna let you go first, but
I was thinking about what I was gonna tell my editors about your story.
I'll tell my editors that you said that. Look, I think popular myths, whether we're too negative, are just a professional issue across journalism, whether it's dealing with China or not. I think of the American Rust Belt, right? I also have another story up today about which is a kind of weekend essay that we do on thinking about Pittsburgh, right? And thinking about the kind of eds and meds model there. And this weird clash that we have, where the Trump administration is framing between universities and kind of industrial America. And actually they're much closer related, and the future of industry is being born in universities and so on. So I think that's one example here in the, it drives me nuts whenever someone says the economy is great or the economy stinks, because it all depends on where you're sitting, right? And the US economy is yes, there's this, the macro economy, but it's many different economies. I think the economist Margaret pointed out recently that probably a dozen US states are in a technical recession right now. And so you need to think about that. Depends where you are on the income ladder, right? The top 10% of consumers in the United States are now responsible for 50% of the consumption. It might even be 90% of consumption. I might have that number wrong. But the point is that the bottom 10% of by income aren't doing so great. And so it's this applies to China, it applies to the United States, it applies to Europe. I think the cartoon version of the French probably isn't very close to reality, et cetera, and so on. And I just think you have to constantly, as journalists, kind of just poise like, do I really know this? Is this really what I see? Am I being objective here? And so on. And I don't think that's saying, on the one hand, here are the negatives, and on the other hand, here are the positives. I don't think that's always being negative, being objective. I think there's a kind of a balancing that you have to do, and so on. So that's a really long way of me avoiding your question.
Do we frame China's stories too much in terms of national security, US national security concerns?
Well, I think that when it comes to a lot of, so-called myths about the way China is operating, let's just say technology, I think two things can be true. I think that there can be a state-directed effort to try to control a particular technology, but I think there's also a pure profit, huge, profit motive based on, deep competition in China between companies trying to build the best possible product. I mean, I think it's as simple and complex as that both can be true.
If I can jump on that
Yeah.
point, I do think the idea that there are narratives that is an important idea, but it's also important to remember that there are facts that are separate from those narratives or that exist outside of them, and that narratives can shift. And so I think that Shawn's story is something that I've been trying to convince people in DC that need to be prepared. If you're interested in kind of developing EVs in the United States, what happens if there is a deal with Trump and China about kind of encouraging China's investment in the United States? Is there going to be local resistance to that? Is there going to be congressional resistance to that? Is there going to be labor resistance to I think thinking through these beyond the narratives that exist today or dominant today, to think through the possibilities and get outside of those narratives. I think it can be very hard, especially in this town, to get beyond anything narratives that dominate the day, to think about scenarios and possible realities. And I think that one thing about this administration and this president is that uncertainty is real and present always. And so having to think, I think it encourages and rewards those who are willing to think about what if, because there's a lot of you never know what is going to happen.
And then on his second question, and let me ask Margaret and Jeremy about this, like what are, he wants concrete examples of like a type of framework for China or narrative that has now, as dominant, still dominant now, but that that you might think is a myth. And so what are some examples of that?
I guess here I would say something like the idea of China Inc., the idea that China works as a kind of like universal actor that is kind of going about the world acting on its own interests, when in fact, as was just hinted at, right, Chinese firms are in cutthroat competition, like destroying each other on a day-to-day basis, and BYD investing in Brazil is very different than the various other like kind of like EV like neo investors. It's like they're trying to kill each other, these firms, and they're fighting. And so the idea that this is all in China's interest as opposed to interesting actors inside of a country of 1.4 billion people kind of pursuing their own self-interest inside of a political system that has particular rewards and constraints. It's a much more complicated story than China Inc. And we need to worry about what China is doing. I think breaking that kind of singular piece is for me the biggest myth and dominant frame.
Yeah, I mean, and then I would add, that's a terrific one. It's one that I've thought about a lot too. China Inc. also kind of grand strategy, the idea that Xi Jinping is sitting there making every single decision about every investment that's being made across the Latin American region or wherever, right? Which one it's one that's pervasive, and it's certainly here, reference to in the Latin American context as well. Debt trap, as we've already talked about, right? That's one, and especially in Latin America, since we haven't really seen finance there. And large scale loans, right? Sovereign lending there since around 2015, 2016 in any real way. Certainly not the 40 billion that we saw in 2010, for instance. The other one, this is not about China necessarily, but it's one that you hear in Latin America, which I think is, or the US perpetuates, right, about its relationship with Latin America vis-a-vis China. And it's that the US, and I don't know how often I hear this, probably on a monthly basis, that, if only we were there and only we were doing things, that we would be the preferred partner. And that may be very well be true, right? If there's a US offer, if there's an infusion of capital, if there's something of a coordinated strategy, right, that could be proposed, whether at the bilateral level or hemispherically, that would be preferred to anything China has to offer. But I think we need to think a little bit more in depth about that, and especially because there are different things that China offers, right? And a lot of this that the US is not capable at this particular juncture of providing, whether it develops a strategy or not. And so really thinking through that particular assumption would be really, I think, quite valuable.
So good news and bad news. The good news is that lunch is here. I see in the back. The bad news is we're out of time for further insights from our panelists. One thing that Margaret's last comment on grand strategy brought to mind is I can't count the number of times I've been at parties or discussions in Washington where someone will come up to me and they'll say, and we'll be talking about US-China policy usually. And usually it's someone who is somewhat critical of the US approach to China, whether it's in a Democratic administration or Republican administration. They'll say, well, the Chinese always think of things in terms of decades or centuries, and we're very short-sighted. And it's like one of the biggest myths, I think, about policymaking in China. There are many myths out there. And that's like it's generally people use that in a positive manner about China. But anyways, thank you to everyone on this panel for your insights. And thank you to Shawn for giving us previews of your stories. And thanks for the great questions. And we can have more discussion about this over lunch. Thank you.